There are nights that stay with you, not because they were loud or because the world shifted on its axis in a way that anyone else would notice, but because they were so incredibly quiet. Have you ever had a moment where you realized your life had changed, but the only sound was the rain against the glass? That is how it happened for me. You don't forget a night like that. The rain outside was relentless. It clawed at the windows of our bedroom, scratching against the glass like it had something urgent to say, like a warning I was too comfortable to hear. Inside, it was supposed to be our sanctuary, our safe little haven away from the noise of the world. But safety is an illusion when the distance between two people grows too wide to bridge. It was her voice that cut through the darkness. "Don't be clingy, Mark." That was all Dana said. There was no anger in her tone. There was no shouting. There wasn't even a sigh of frustration. It was flat, matter of fact, as if she were telling me the milk had gone bad, or that it was Tuesday. Don't be clingy. Then the sound of movement, the shuffle of her slippers across the hardwood floor, the soft rustle of fabric as she gathered her pillow against her chest like a hostage. And then she drifted out of the room, toward the couch in the living room. I didn't move. I sat there, frozen, halfway between the lingering warmth of our bed and the sudden, absolute ice of her rejection. My hand was still half raised in the dark. I was trying to make sense of what had just happened. 1 second, I had leaned in for an instinctive kiss goodnight. It was something we had done 1,000 times. A ritual, a reflex, the kind of small intimacy you don't think about because it's just part of the air you breathe. And the next second, I was a stranger. I was a nuisance. I was the needy man she couldn't be bothered to tolerate anymore. I didn't follow her. What would I say? What is there to say when the person you swore to share your life with decide your affection is a burden? Instead, I lay back down. I stared at the ceiling. It was too dark to see clearly, but I knew every inch of that drywall. I traced the invisible lines of the water stains from last winter's storm. Funny, isn't it? What sticks with you when you can't sleep? I thought about the roof we never got around to fixing. I thought about the quiet ticking of the clock on the dresser, the one Dana always said she hated, but we never replaced. And I listened to the silence. It was an unbearable silence, the kind that rings in your ears, the kind that is louder than any scream. Can you imagine lying next to someone for 5 years, sharing a mortgage, sharing meals, sharing a life, only to feel lonelier than you did in your freshman dorm room? The thing is, lying there in the dark, I wasn't even angry yet. I was stunned. I felt like someone had yanked the curtain back on a play I didn't know I was acting in. I had been reading from one script, thinking we were a team, thinking we were us. And she had been reading from a completely different script, one where I was just an obstacle to her sleep. I watched the rain smudge the world outside the window. Somewhere between the roll of thunder and the faint creak of the living room floorboards settling under her weight, I realized something painful. This wasn't new. This wasn't a sudden snap. This was just the moment the branch finally broke. The affection between us had been evaporating in degrees. Slowly, quietly, a missed dinner here, a shorter conversation there, a separate blanket, a separate routine. This was just the first time she didn't bother to pretend anymore. Dana, my wife, the woman who, in the beginning, used to send me 10 texts in an hour because she couldn't fall asleep without hearing my voice. The woman who used to rest her head on my shoulder while we watched television, tangling her fingers in mine. Now, I couldn't even get her to stay in the same bed. Let me give you a quick snapshot of my life, just so you understand a man lying in that dark room. I am middle-class normal. My life is seasoned with a dash of heavy routine. I am 52 years old. I work in IT support for a logistics firm downtown. It is not glamorous work. It involves a lot of resetting passwords and asking people if they've tried turning it off and on again. But it pays the bills. It keeps the lights on. I drive a 1998 Mustang. It sits in the driveway like a monument to good intentions. For years, I have been telling anyone who would listen, I'll restore it. Someday. But I never do. Or I never did. Our house sits on a quiet street in Spokane. We have neighbors we wave to but don't know. 2 bedrooms. A garden Dana wanted desperately when we bought the place, but she never tended to it. The weeds grew, and eventually I just started mowing over flower beds to keep it tidy. We have a fancy espresso machine she insisted on buying. It cost a fortune. But now only I use it. We used to cook dinner together. We used to watch reruns of Friends. We used to have passionate, silly arguments about whether Ross and Rachel were actually on a break. Little things. Ordinary things. Safe things. That is what a marriage is made of, isn't it? The safe, boring mortar that holds the bricks together. Until now. Now, even the ordinary had turned sharp. The safety had turned into a trap. I didn't sleep much that night. The rain eventually stopped, leaving behind a heavy, damp stillness. When I finally closed my eyes, the weight of that single phrase hung above me like a stone ready to fall. Don't be clingy. It replayed in my mind. The tone, the dismissal, the absolute lack of care for how it would land. But I'll tell you this. That stone didn't crush me. It woke me up. There are decisions that we only understand why we were wrong about when we are old. I had decided to be patient. I had decided to be understanding. I had decided to wait for her to come back to me. But lying there, alone in a double bed, I realized that waiting was a mistake. What would you do? What would you do if the one person who swore to love you started treating you like a burden? Because as the sun started to turn the gray sky a lighter shade of gray, I made a choice. I was done pretending everything was fine. I was done being the only one holding up the roof. And trust me, this night, this was just the first crack in the foundation. I woke up before the alarm. It is an old habit, or maybe just muscle memory. Or perhaps it is simply the kind of restless sleep that doesn't let your body forget disappointment. When you go to sleep with a heavy mind, morning doesn't feel like a fresh start. It feels like resuming a sentence you wish you hadn't started writing. The rain had finally stopped, but everything outside the window still felt soaked in it. The light coming through the blinds was weak and gray, the color of wet pavement. I sat up slowly, the mattress creaking beneath me. I glanced at the empty space beside me. Her pillow was gone. There was no indentation in the mattress, no lingering warmth, just a blank, smooth patch of sheet where my wife should have been. In the past, on mornings like this, I might have felt a pang of worry. I might have gotten up, walked to the living room, and gently woke her up. I might have apologized, even if I didn't know what I was apologizing for, just to bridge the gap. But not this morning. I didn't call out. I didn't go looking. I swung my legs out of bed and headed straight for the kitchen, my bare feet slapping against the cold tile of the hallway. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, wishing I could rub away the memory of her words from the night before just as easily. Making breakfast had always been my thing. It was one of those unspoken contracts in a marriage. Dana handled the bills and the social calendar. I handled the mornings. Bacon, eggs, toast. It was nothing fancy. I'm not a chef. But there was something about starting the day with the smell of butter sizzling in the pan that made the world feel orderly. It made things feel normal. So I did it. I went through emotions mechanically, like a robot programmed with a decade of routine. I pulled the carton from the fridge. I heated the skillet. I cracked 2 eggs. 2 eggs, not 4. I watched them hit the pan. Slightly runny yolks, just the way I liked them. I dropped 2 slices of bread into the toaster. Just 2. Usually, I would salt hers lightly and pepper mine heavily. Dana hates salt, or at least she used to. It's hard to keep track of what she likes and hates lately. But this time, the shaker stayed on the counter. I didn't plate hers. I slid my eggs onto a dish, poured a mug of black coffee, and sat at the kitchen island. It sounds petty, doesn't it, to withhold a piece of toast? But when you have given everything else, your patience, your dignity, your affection, and it has been returned to you unopened, you start to hold back the small things, too. I pulled out my phone and started flipping through a forum thread on car modifications. Some guy in Ohio had figured out how to get an extra 30 horsepower from a cold air intake on a V6 engine. It was useless information to me, really. I didn't have the parts. I didn't have the money. And frankly, I didn't have the time. But reading about torque and fuel ratios beat listening to my own thoughts echo around the empty kitchen. She came in eventually. I didn't need to look up to know it was her. I heard the scuff of her slippers. She had her hair tied up in a messy bun, wearing an oversized hoodie that swallowed her hands. She wore no makeup. She didn't have that sharp, polished look she wears for the world. This was just Dana. She stopped at the edge of the kitchen. There was a pause. She looked at the stove, then at me, then at the empty counter where her plate usually sat waiting. She looked vaguely surprised, like she had forgotten I existed. Or perhaps she was surprised that the service she expected had been discontinued without notice. "No food for me?" she asked. There was a lazy tease in her voice. She was trying to act like last night hadn't happened. She was testing the waters, assuming the water was still warm, assuming I was still the steady, predictable Mark who would jump up and say, "Sorry, honey, let me make you some." I didn't even glance up from my phone. She stood there for a beat, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the apology that used to come so easily from me. But the only sound in the room was the soft swipe of my thumb scrolling on the screen and the faint clink of my spoon against a ceramic mug. The kitchen took on a strange stillness. It wasn't peaceful. It felt stuck, like a pause movie where nothing breathes unless someone presses play again. But I wasn't going to press play. After a long, awkward minute, she moved. She opened the fridge, the light spilling out across the floor. She rummaged around for a moment, shifting jars and containers, before pulling out a carton of almond milk and a half-eaten yogurt. She sat across from me at the island. She peeled the foil lid off the yogurt and stirred it. She looked at me, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to ask how she slept, waiting for me to be the husband she was used to ignoring. I didn't speak. Neither did she. It felt surreal. We were sitting 3 feet apart, yet we might as well have been on different continents. It was like we were acting in a commercial for unhappy couples. Plastic smiles, quiet chewing, 2 people orbiting each other without ever colliding or connecting. And here's the thing I need you to understand. I wasn't trying to punish her. This wasn't a tactic to make her mad. It wasn't a strategy to get her attention. I just didn't have the energy anymore. I didn't have the energy to keep reaching across a distance that she kept expanding. I used to fill that silence with small talk. I used to ask about her day, her projects, the novel she started 3 years ago and never finished. I used to be the noise that filled the empty spaces in our home. But now I let the silence speak. I let her feel the shape of it. Maybe for the first time in 5 years, she was having to sit in the quiet that she had created. When I finished eating, I stood up. I rinsed my plate in the sink, wiped the counter down with a sponge, and dried my hands. I left her sitting there with her almond milk and a spoon she didn't seem interested in using. "I'm heading out," I said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact. Outside, the sun had clawed its way through the clouds, but the world still looked gray. The pavement was steaming slightly as the moisture evaporated. I got into my Mustang. The leather of the seat was cold and cracked, but it felt familiar. It felt like mine. I turned the key. The engine coughed once, then rumbled to life with a low, throaty growl. The car vibrated around me. That sound, it gave me something I hadn't felt in a while. Control. Can you guess what it is like to start detaching from someone you love? It doesn't happen with a bang. It happens with a breakfast. It is quieter than you would expect. And strangely, it stings less than you fear. But it hollows you out in a way that no scream ever could. That morning, for the first time in months, I didn't ask where she was going later. I didn't remind her to take her umbrella because the forecast called for more rain. I didn't say, "Love you" out of habit as I walked out the door, and she didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and she just didn't know how to fix it. But by the time I pulled out of the driveway and onto the main road, I had already stopped thinking about the empty spot in the bed. I had already started thinking about something else entirely. Something that didn't revolve around her. Something with wheels. Something that could be fixed with a wrench and a little bit of patience. Because unlike a marriage, when a car breaks down, you can usually find out why. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I did something entirely for myself. I signed the lease on a garage across town. It wasn't much to look at. It was a small, narrow space tucked behind an industrial park. The rent was cheap because the roof leaked in the corner, and the floor was stained with decades of other men's projects. It smelled intensely of old oil, wet concrete, and dust. To most people, it would have smelled like neglect. But the moment I stepped inside and pulled the metal chain to rattle the rolling door shut, it smelled like something else. It smelled like oxygen. It felt like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding finally escaped my lungs. I didn't tell Dana. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Keeping secrets is the first step toward the end. But I wasn't hiding it because I was doing something wrong. I wasn't hiding a mistress or a gambling habit. I just didn't feel like explaining it. I didn't have the energy to justify my joy to someone who barely noticed when I left the room. Why offer up the pieces of yourself to someone who treats them like clutter? You see that old '98 Mustang in my driveway? For the last decade, it was more than just a car. It was a rolling sculpture of procrastination. It was a promise I kept breaking to myself. Every time I walked past it, I would pat the roof and think, someday I'll fix it. Someday I'll have the time. Someday, when things settle down, I'll bring her back to life. We tell ourselves that a lot, don't we? Someday. It is the lie we use to comfort ourselves while we let our own lives rust in the rain. We think time is a bank account that keeps filling up, but it's not. It's a leak. And eventually, you run dry. Well, standing in that empty garage, I decided that someday had finally shown up, and it didn't knock politely. It kicked the door down. I moved the car there the next evening. I started ordering parts. Nothing major at first, just the basics. Spark plugs, a new distributor cap, air filters, the kind of things that are small but essential. I began to spend hours under that hood. The air around me grew thick with the scent of gasoline and grit. My hands, usually clean from typing on a keyboard all day, became stained with grease that soap couldn't quite reach. And in that grime, I found something I hadn't felt in months. Independence. It was a kind of solitude that wasn't lonely. It was quiet. It was purposeful. Every bolt I turned, every wire I reconnected, every smudge of grease on my forearm felt more real than the strained words Dana and I had been tossing at each other for months. Of course, she noticed eventually, you can't hide boxes arriving at the front door forever. It started small. One evening, I came home late. I was covered in sweat and engine grime, my shirt clinging to my back. Dana looked up from her tablet. She was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, looking like a queen inspecting a peasant. She looked at me like I had missed a curfew I didn't know I had. "How much are you spending on all this?" she asked. Her tone was somewhere between curiosity and accusation. It was that specific pitch designed to make you feel irresponsible. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, wiping my hands on an old rag still scented with brake cleaner. I shrugged. "Less than therapy," I said. She didn't laugh. She didn't argue. She just blinked. It was like I had spoken in a language she hadn't bothered to learn. The punchline had landed somewhere far away from her understanding. But here's the key difference. I didn't press. In the past, I would have pulled up the bank account. I would have shown her the spreadsheet. I would have explained that this was my hobby, that I deserved a little something for myself. I would have begged for her approval. But I realized I didn't owe her a justification anymore. At least not for the things that finally made me feel human again. The next day, she texted me while I was at work. "Home early tonight?" I saw the message pop up on my screen. And then I went to the garage. I was elbow deep in a carburetor adjustment, drenched in sweat under a dying fluorescent light that buzzed like an angry hornet. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, and for the first time in ages, I didn't feel the panic. I didn't feel the need to wipe my hands and answer right away. I let it sit. This garage, this mechanical sanctuary, it wasn't just a place to fix a car. It was where I started fixing myself. Can you imagine the feeling of rebuilding something with your bare hands while everything else around you quietly breaks? It gives you a strange kind of clarity. When you are tuning an engine, you have to listen. You have to be patient. You have to respect the machine. If you force a bolt, it snaps. If you ignore a rattle, the engine fails. Relationships are the same, aren't they? But we ignore the rattles for years. Working on the car, I stopped chasing apologies that never came. I stopped waiting for affection that arrived only when it was convenient for her. And slowly, without theatrics, without slamming doors, I stopped being the version of myself that let it all slide. So I stayed later. I ordered more parts. I let the smell of engine oil soak into my skin like armor. Dana would mention money here and there. "You've made like 5 Amazon orders this week," she said one night, standing in the doorway while I unlaced my boots. "Probably 6. I muttered, not looking up. She rolled her eyes. She let out a heavy sigh, the kind that used to make me scramble to fix whatever was wrong. But the fight she was hoping for, I didn't give it to her. Because the truth was, every argument she tried to spark only made me more certain, more still, more free. You'd be surprised how good it feels to hold something that only works because you made it so. Something that doesn't lie. Something that doesn't flinch when you touch it. Something that doesn't sigh when you walk into the room. A machine has no hidden agenda. It doesn't play mind games. It is either fixed or it is broken. And sometimes that simple honesty is exactly what a man needs when his reality has become too complicated to explain. Making new friends when you are over 50 is a strange business. When we are young, we make friends like we breathe. We bond over shared classes, bad cafeteria food, or just being in the same place at the same time. But as we get older, our circles tighten. We stop letting people in. We retreat into our routines, our families, and our work. We become islands. And sometimes, without realizing it, we begin to sink. I wasn't looking for a friend. I wasn't looking for a social circle. I was just looking for a socket wrench that had rolled under a workbench. The first time I met Caleb was over that dropped wrench and a shared curse word. He owned the bay next to mine. I had seen him around. A tall guy, broad-shouldered, with sleeves always rolled up past his elbows and hands that were calloused and stained, like he'd been born holding a torque wrench. I was struggling with a rusted bolt on the Mustang's manifold. My hand slipped, the wrench flew, and it skidded across the concrete floor, rolling right under the chain-link fence that separated our spaces. I stood up, wiping sweat from my forehead, dreading the interaction. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to explain myself. But Caleb was already bending down. He grabbed the tool, weighed it in his hand for a second, and looked up at me with a grin that was entirely too easygoing for a Tuesday night. "You're the guy resurrecting the '98 Mustang, right?" he asked. He walked over to the fence and handed the wrench back through the gap. "Trying to," I replied, taking it. "She's fighting me every inch of the way." He laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder to his own project, an old Honda Civic that looked like it had been resurrected 3 times over. It was ugly, mismatched, and beautiful in a way only a mechanic could understand. "They always fight," Caleb said. "That's how you know they're worth it. If it was easy, everyone would drive a lease." He wiped his hands on his jeans. "You should bring it to the meet Friday night. We got a little crew that hangs out behind the old lumber yard. Nothing illegal, just engines and cheap beer. No egos." I wanted to say no. My instinct was to retreat. I didn't do well with new people. Not lately. My confidence was shot, and the idea of standing around with strangers felt exhausting. I had spent the last year feeling like I didn't belong in my own house. Why would I belong there? But something in his tone, easy, open, zero pressure, cut through the usual static in my head. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just opening a door. "I'll think about it," I said. "Do that," he nodded, turning back to his car. "We're there from 8 till the cops or the wives call." That Friday I showed up. I went half out of curiosity and half out of desperate need to not go home to the silence. The lumber yard was an abandoned lot on the edge of town, bordered by tall pine trees that blocked out the streetlights. When I pulled in, my stomach was in knots. But then I killed the engine, stepped out, and looked around. There were about 10 of them. It wasn't just guys. There were a couple women. 2. It was a mix of ages, races, and tax brackets. One girl, who I later learned was named Tara, leaned against a pickup truck with tires taller than my hood. Another guy, an older man with white hair, sat on the bumper of a pristine vintage Cadillac. Caleb was there, leaning against his Frankenstein Honda, holding a beer. When he saw me, he didn't make a big deal of it. He didn't stop the conversation to announce the new guy. He just raised his bottle in a silent salute and nodded, and something shifted in my chest. The air smelled of unburnt fuel, pine needles, and the coming autumn. Someone had a portable speaker playing classic rock, low enough to be background noise, but loud enough to fill the gaps in conversation. We talked shop. We shared tips. We swapped stories about roadside breakdowns and impossible repairs that somehow worked with duct tape and prayer. For the first time in a very long time, I felt included. Caleb walked over, handed me a cold bottle, and clinked the glass against mine. "Glad you made it," he said. He walked around my Mustang, his eyes scanning the engine bay I had been agonizing over. He nodded slowly. "You got a good eye, Mark. That wiring harness work you did, that's clean. Most guys rush that." I almost didn't know how to respond. "Thanks," I mumbled, looking down at my shoes. Compliments used to be part of my life. Dana used to tell me I was steady. That was her word for me. Steady, dependable, solid. But somewhere along the line, steady became boring, and then boring became invisible. Here, under the yellow glow of the street lamps, I wasn't someone's husband. I wasn't someone's disappointment. I wasn't the guy sleeping in the guest room of his own marriage. I was just Mark. And for these people, that was enough. Can you picture it? The freedom of it? People laughing. Engines revving occasionally just to hear the song of the pistons, leaning against hoods like teenagers who never outgrew the rush of motion. It was simple. It was primitive, maybe, but it felt like breathing again after holding your breath underwater for years. That night, I stayed out past midnight. I lost track of time. I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't wondering if I was breathing too loud or taking up too much space. When I finally pulled into my own driveway, the house was dark. But as I walked inside, I noticed the signs. Dana was already asleep, or pretending to be, but the bathroom light was left on. Her makeup bag was sitting on the counter, unzipped. I noticed the cap of her eyeliner was left unscrewed. That was strange. Dana never wore eyeliner at home. Not for me. Not anymore. The next morning, she hovered near the door while I laced up my boots. The kitchen smelled of coffee I hadn't made. "Late night?" she asked. Her voice was casual. Too casual. It was the kind of tone that is trying desperately not to sound like an interrogation. I didn't stop tying my laces. "Yeah, you've been gone a lot," she said. She shifted closer, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah," I said again, standing up and grabbing my keys. "Needed air." She opened her mouth to say something else. I could see the question forming on her lips. Maybe she wanted to ask where I was. Maybe she wanted to ask who I was with. Or maybe, just maybe, she wanted to ask why I wasn't sharing my time with her anymore. But then she closed her mouth. She looked at me like she wasn't sure if she had the right to ask. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't wait for the guilt trip. I walked out the door, the morning air cool on my face. When I got to the garage that morning, I did something ridiculous. I patted the Mustang's roof. "You're the only one who listens," I joked to the cold metal. But as I unlocked the toolbox and the smell of grease hit me, I realized it wasn't just a joke. I caught my reflection in the side mirror. I was smiling. It was a small smile, a tired smile, but it was there. I wasn't smiling for her. I wasn't smiling to keep the peace. I wasn't smiling to prove I was okay. I was smiling simply because I was happy. And that is a dangerous thing for a failing marriage. When you realize you can be happy without the other person, the fear of losing them begins to vanish. And when the fear vanishes, the truth is the only thing left standing. And you know what? It wasn't just a joke I told the car, because something had changed, slowly at first, and then all at once. I was smiling again, not for her, not to prove something, just because the weight was gone. But here is the strange physics of relationships. When one person stops pushing, the other person suddenly loses their balance. It started with her lipstick. It was a Tuesday evening. I walked in from the garage, my boots heavy on the floor, smelling like brake fluid and that cheap gas station coffee I had started drinking. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Dana was standing in front of the hallway mirror. She was leaning in close, applying a soft coral shade to her lips. It was a color I hadn't seen since our 3rd anniversary dinner. She jumped a little when she saw me in the reflection. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was more like surprise, as if she had been caught rehearsing lines for a play she hadn't told me about. "Oh," she said, capping the tube. "You're back." I nodded, slipping past her toward the kitchen to wash my hands. I didn't stop. I didn't compliment her. I didn't ask where she was going or who the makeup was for. "Didn't mean to interrupt," I said. "You didn't," she replied quickly. Too quickly. But I had, and we both knew it. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The cold shoulder she had given me weeks ago began to thaw, but it wasn't a natural thaw. It felt manufactured. It felt like a strategy. Subtle moves. Strategic silences. She started lingering in places she used to avoid. She would stand by the bedroom door while I was folding laundry. She would sit on the couch in the living room, right in my line of sight, instead of disappearing into the spare room with her tablet. She even wandered out to the garage entrance one evening. Now, you have to understand, Dana hates the garage. She says it smells like fumes and feels like a dungeon. But there she was, leaning against the doorframe, watching me organize my socket wrenches. She started brushing against me, accidentally. I would reach for the remote, and her hand would be there. I would turn the corner in the hallway, and she would be just close enough that our arms grazed. One night, I was adjusting the volume on the stereo, and her hand touched my forearm. It stayed there for a second too long. It was light, tentative, deliberate. "Sorry," she whispered, looking up at me through her lashes. "Didn't realize I was in your way." I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away in anger. I just looked at her hand, then at her face. "You're blocking the toolbox," I said. I meant it literally. I needed a screwdriver that was behind her hip, but the words hung in the air with a weight I hadn't intended, yet didn't regret. I stepped around her. I wasn't being cold. I was just being clear. The thing is, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger implies passion. Anger implies that you are still fighting for the outcome. I wasn't fighting. I had simply stopped being available in that way. The switch had flipped. The damage had been done weeks ago. Quietly, surgically, on that night, she pulled her pillow off our bed and took the warmth with it. Now, we were just two people coexisting in a house filled with polite avoidance and faint, ghostly traces of old affection. One afternoon, she stood in the hallway wearing a perfume I hadn't smelled in over a year. It was the expensive stuff, the bottle she saved for weddings and galas. I passed her on my way to the kitchen, and the scent hit me like a memory. For a second, just a second, it worked. My brain instantly pulled up a dozen memories of better times. But then I looked at her eyes. They were anxious. They were searching. "New cologne?" she asked, reaching lightly for my sleeve. "Nope," I replied, unlocking the back door. "Just oil." She blinked. She bit her lip. She looked like she wanted to scream or cry or shake me. But she let me go. Can you feel that kind of tension? It is the tension of someone trying to drag you back into a rhythm they destroyed. She was trying to dance, but the music had stopped for me a long time ago. She started wearing the silk robe I once told her looked incredible on her. She suddenly took up yoga again, doing her stretches in the middle of the living room floor, right where I couldn't help but notice. She laughed louder on her phone calls when I was in the room. She lingered on the front porch when I came home, acting like she was just checking the mail at 7 p.m. It was all very choreographed, but she never said the words. She never said, "I messed up." She never said, "I miss you." She never said, "I'm sorry I made you feel small." She just wanted me to come back to her. Without her having to admit, she pushed me away. And I wasn't going to rescue her from the silence. This wasn't a Cold War. A Cold War implies two sides waiting to strike. This was a surrender. It was a surrendering to the realization that influence isn't the same thing as love. And it was my surrender to the peace that comes from emotional detachment. Every room in the house began to feel like a negotiation. The kitchen became a minefield. She placed takeout menus near my keys, hinting at a dinner together. The bathroom became a stage. She played music while she showered, humming along to songs we used to slow dance to in the kitchen 10 years ago. The couch became a test. She would sit with her feet just close enough to brush mine, waiting to see if I would move away or lean in. It was a test she wasn't sure how to grade. But I had my own test now, and she was failing it without even knowing the questions. I still did the dishes. I still took out the trash. I still answered when she asked if the light bulb in the hallway needed replacing. I was a good roommate. I was polite, but my laughter, my gaze, my presence, those things had migrated elsewhere. They lived in a garage with peeling paint on the walls, with the hum of electric fans and the steady heartbeat of restoration. She was finally reaching out. I give her credit for that. But she wasn't reaching out to the man she had married. She was reaching out to the ghost of who I used to be. She was reaching out to the convenience I provided. And honestly, I wasn't sure that man lived here anymore. I watched her from a distance, like a scientist observing a chemical reaction. I saw the panic in her eyes when her charms didn't work. I saw the confusion when her perfume didn't make me stop. She was realizing that you cannot break a person and then expect them to hold you together when you get lonely. I walked out to the garage that night, the scent of her perfume still clinging to the hallway air. I took a deep breath of the cool night wind to clear my head. Inside the garage, the Mustang sat waiting. It was a mess of wires and metal, but it was honest. I picked up a wrench. I turned on the radio, and I let the world outside the garage door fade away. Because out there in the house, she was playing a game, and I had finally decided to stop keeping score. The steak was overcooked. I could smell it the moment I walked through the front door. The scent of charred meat hung heavy in the hallway, mixing uncomfortably with that floral perfume she had started wearing again. Dana always liked hers medium rare, pink in the center, tender, but the piece of meat sitting on the plate she had set out for me leaned closer to shoe leather. It was gray at the edges, stiff, but she plated it anyway. She had sprinkled it with rosemary, a nice touch, and added a side of garlic mashed potatoes. There was a bottle of red wine open on the table, breathing. It was a Cabernet, the expensive kind we used to call our bottle, the one we only open for promotions or anniversaries. The dining room was dim. The candles were lit, not the scented jar candles she burned to hide the smell of the dog we didn't have. These were the long, tapered ones, the formal ones. We hadn't touched those since last Christmas. She stood beside the dining table like a hostess waiting for a VIP guest. Or maybe like a captain going down with the ship, insisting on wearing her dress uniform. For a moment, I paused in the entryway. I didn't pause because the gesture moved me. I paused because I recognized the desperation beneath the detail. I saw the effort, and it made my chest ache. Not with love, but with a dull, heavy pity. "Dinner's ready," she said. She offered a small, tight smile. She tucked a loose curl behind her ear, a nervous habit she had when she was lying or when she was scared. "Hope you're hungry." I was hungry. My stomach was empty after 6 hours of wrestling with rusted exhaust manifold. But I wasn't hungry for what she meant. I wasn't hungry for the reconciliation she was serving alongside the potatoes. "Thanks," I said. My voice was steady, polite. "I'll eat quick." Got some paperwork to finish. Her face twitched. It was just a flash, a micro-expression of disappointment before she masked it with a sip of wine. She had imagined a long, lingering meal. She had imagined laughter. She had imagined that a piece of meat and a glass of wine could rewrite the last 3 months of silence. "I thought maybe we could sit down together," she said, forcing her voice to sound casual. Like before. That word, it does more damage than we realize. We spend so much of our middle age chasing before, forgetting that you can never really go back. You can only go forward, and sometimes you have to go forward alone. I didn't argue. I didn't sigh. I just walked to the sink, washed the grease from my hands, and took a seat. The fork was polished. The napkin was folded into a triangle. Even my glass had ice cubes the way I like them. 2, not crushed. She had remembered the specs. She had just forgotten the man. I took a bite. I chewed. I swallowed. It was mechanical. Thanks, I said again. I focused on the food. I ate efficiently. Not fast, not slow, just efficient. Like the meal was fuel, not communion. Across the table, her fork stayed still. She watched me more than she touched her food. Her wine level dropped steadily. Mine remained full. The steak sat on her plate, untouched, the juices bleeding slowly into the white porcelain. The silence stretched between us. It wasn't the comfortable silence of the garage. It was a pressurized silence, the kind that makes your ears pop. So, she ventured. Her voice was light, brittle. Garage stuff still keeping you busy? I dapped my mouth with a napkin. Yeah, it's good work. Keeps me focused. She took another sip of wine. Her eyes dropped to the tablecloth. She traced a pattern in the fabric with her fingernail. You don't talk much lately, she whispered. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:15. I'm around, I said. Then I looked at her, really looked at her. You just stopped listening a while ago, Dana. And eventually, I stopped trying to be heard. That landed. She looked down, then up, her eyes wet, but I was already stacking my plate. I stood up, scraped the leftovers into the trash, and rinsed the dish in the sink. It was a habit now, muscle memory. Clean up your own mess. Leave no trace. Rely on no one. It was a code I had been living by since the night on the couch. Behind me, I heard the scrape of her chair against the floor. The table remained set for two. The candles were still flickering, casting long, dancing shadows against the wall. The wine was still breathing. Her steak was still warm, but cooling fast. Do you hate me? The question was quiet. It barely carried across the room. I paused at the sink, my hands under the warm water. The smell of lemon dish soap rose between us. It was a question she had been building up to for weeks. It was a fear that had driven the lipstick, the yoga, the overcooked steak. I turned off the tap. I dried my hands on a towel. I turned slightly to face her. She looked small. She looked terrified. No, I said, and I meant it. I didn't hate her. Hate requires energy. Hate is a fire you have to keep feeding. I don't hate you, Dana. I looked her in the eye, and I delivered the truth that was far worse than hate. I just stopped needing your permission to be okay. The words hung there. Simple. Devastating. That landed harder than any scream would have. Because in that moment, she realized the dynamic had shifted permanently. She realized that she held no leverage. She realized that her approval, which she had withheld for so long as a punishment, was no longer a prize I was seeking. I grabbed my keys from the counter. I'm going to the shop, I said. The garage wasn't waiting. It was calling. Because out there, under the flickering fluorescent lights, amidst the quiet tap of socket wrenches and the smell of old iron, I found something she'd forgotten how to offer. Peace. Not passion. Not excitement. Not an apology. Just the space to exist without being diminished. The space to be myself without having to audit my own personality to fit into her mood. I walked out the door. I left her standing there between the wine and the silence, between the steak and the guilt. I left her standing in the ruin of a dinner that was 5 years too late. And as I walked to the car, I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I didn't feel a sense of revenge. I just felt light. It is a strange thing to realize that the person you thought was your anchor was actually just a weight holding you down. And once you cut that line, you don't drift away. You finally start to sail. It was supposed to be just a bonfire. Nothing fancy. No tablecloths, no candles, no expectations. Just Caleb's annual get-together out by the lake. Picture a clearing surrounded by tall pines, the ground covered in dry needles, rusty folding chairs set up in a loose circle, a cooler full of cheap beer. The kind of gathering where the only admission price is a story about a car that broke your heart or a repair that emptied your wallet. The cars were lined up like proud sentinels under the trees. Caleb's Honda, my Mustang, which I had finally gotten running smooth enough for the drive, and a dozen others. They gleamed in the moonlight, metal beasts resting after the hunt. I wasn't expecting Dana to come. I hadn't invited her. I hadn't even told her where I was going. But in the age of smartphones and shared cloud accounts, privacy is often just a setting we forget to toggle. Or maybe she just followed the rumble of the exhaust. I was standing by the fire, holding a bottle that was sweating in the night air. The heat of the flames felt good against the chill coming off the lake. I was talking to Caleb and Tara. Tara was in the middle of telling a story about her old Civic blowing its radiator on the freeway in rush hour traffic. She was animated, using her hands to describe the cloud of steam. It looked like a geyser, she laughed. I thought the car had elected a new pope. We all laughed. It was a genuine belly-deep laugh, the kind that shakes your shoulders. Tara reached out and tapped my arm. It was nothing, a reflex, a punctuation mark to her story. Just a light tap on the bicep, the way you touch a friend when you share a joke. But Dana saw it. I felt the shift in the air before I even saw her. You know that feeling when the barometric pressure drops right before a storm? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned my head. She was walking up the dirt path from the parking area. She was wearing jeans that were too tight and a top that belonged in a downtown bistro, not a dirt lot by a lake. Her hair was done perfectly. She looked beautiful, objectively, but she also looked terrifyingly out of place. She was scanning the group like a hawk scanning a field for field mice. And when her eyes landed on Tara's hand touching my arm, I saw the snap. It wasn't a slow burn. It was an explosion. In that tiny moment, that harmless, hollow gesture was all the fuse she needed. She didn't walk. She stormed. She cut across the clearing, her boots crunching loudly on the gravel. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear, with possession. "So," she announced, her voice cutting to the laughter like a serrated knife. "This is why you're never home." The conversation in the circle died instantly. The fire popped. A log settled into the embers. Someone cleared their throat awkwardly. I didn't panic. In the past, my heart would have been racing. I would have been scrambling for an excuse, trying to de-escalate, trying to protect her feelings. But tonight, I just felt tired. I kept my expression neutral. I took a slow sip of my beer. "Dana," I said calmly, "this isn't the time." "Oh, it never is, right?" she snapped. She stepped into the circle of light, the fire illuminating the sharp angles of her face. "You can ignore my calls. You can disappear for hours. You can treat me like a roommate." But one laugh from her, she pointed a manicured finger at Tara. "And suddenly you're social? Suddenly you have time." Caleb cleared his throat and slowly stepped back, giving us space. It was a kindness, really. He was trying to minimize the audience for her breakdown. I looked around. The circle had tightened. Beer bottles paused midair. People were looking at their shoes, at the fire, anywhere but at us. Dana closed the distance between us. She grabbed my wrist. Her grip was tight, desperate. "Say something," she hissed. "Defend yourself." She wanted to fight. She wanted me to yell. She wanted me to say, "No, Dana, I love you. She means nothing." She wanted the drama because drama feels like passion. Drama feels like connection. Even negative attention is still attention. But I looked her in the eye. "You're making a scene," I said. My voice was low, devoid of the heat she was begging for. "Let go of my arm." The way her mouth parted, it was shock, not rage. Shock. She hadn't expected the firmness. She hadn't expected the wall. She was used to the Mark who pleaded. She was used to the Mark who compromised. She wasn't used to this Mark. The Mark who had spent the last month rebuilding an engine and his own spine. Slowly, her fingers uncurled. She released my wrist. The silence stretched. It was heavy and suffocating. Tara hadn't moved. She stood her ground, arms crossed, watching. She didn't look malicious. She just looked like someone who understood exactly what was happening. She didn't intervene. She knew this wasn't her battle. "I'm going," I said. I didn't ask Dana to come with me. I didn't ask her to follow. I nodded to Caleb. "Sorry about this, man. I'll catch you later." Caleb just nodded back. "All good, Mark. Drive safe." I turned my back on her. I walked toward my Mustang. I could feel her eyes drilling into my back. I could feel the heat of her embarrassment radiating across the clearing. "Mark," she called out. Her voice wavered. It sounded smaller now. "You're just going to leave me here?" I stopped. I opened the car door. The interior light flickered on, a small beacon of safety. "You drove yourself, Dana," I said without turning around. "You can drive yourself home." I got in. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, loud, unapologetic, alive. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The fire was still burning. The sparks were drifting up into the night sky. And there was Dana, standing alone by the flames. A silhouette framed by smoke and shadow. A storm cloud that had lost its thunder and was just left with the rain. I didn't look back again, because something had burned that night. It wasn't the wood. It wasn't the gas. It was the last illusion that she still had control over me. She had tried to use shame as a weapon. She had tried to mark her territory in front of my new world. But all she had done was show everyone, including herself, that she no longer knew the terrain. I drove fast that night. The wind rushed through the cracks in the weather stripping. The radio was off. I didn't go home. Not that night. Not the one after. Because that kind of fire, the kind she brought, it doesn't warm you. It scorches everything it touches. And I was done being burned. I didn't go home. Not that night. Not the one after. Not for the next 6. I packed a small bag, tossing it into the trunk of the Mustang. I drove across town to stay with my brother, Liam. Liam is 3 years older than me. He is divorced, lives in a townhouse that smells perpetually of cedar wood and old books, and he understands the value of silence better than anyone I know. He opened the door at 1 a.m., saw the bag in my hand, and saw the look in my eyes. He didn't ask a single question. He just stepped aside and pointed to the living room. "Couch is yours," he said. "Beer's in the fridge. Don't drink the IPA, that's mine." That was it. He offered me a lumpy sofa, a fridge full of cold bottles, and something Dana hadn't offered in months. Space without judgment. The days blurred together. They became a haze of engine oil, late dinners, and mindless banter with Liam over baseball, games neither of us was really watching. At night, I would lie on that sofa, staring at the ceiling tiles. I would listen to the hum of his refrigerator and the distant traffic of the city. My phone would be buzzing silently beside me on the coffee table. I didn't pick it up. The text started soft. "Hey, can we talk?" I overreacted. "I'm sorry." Then, when I didn't answer, the strategy shifted. The photos started coming. Old selfies from road trips we took 5 years ago. A random snapshot of her in a robe I liked. A picture of a dinner plate with a steak. This time, cooked perfectly pink in the center. Then came the words, "Miss you. Please come home. But here's a question for you. What do you do when someone misses a version of you that they pushed away? Do you go back? Do you try to fit yourself back into the mold that they broke?" I didn't respond. Not out of spite. Not out of cruelty. But out of clarity. Every time the phone vibrated, I felt the pull of it less and less. Each buzz felt smaller, less urgent, like echoes coming from a room I no longer lived in. Liam didn't pry. He knew better than to ask about Dana. He had met her enough times to sense the tension long before I acknowledged it out loud. One afternoon, I was in his driveway, underneath his truck, replacing a worn exhaust clamp. He crouched beside me and handed me a soda. "You good, man?" he asked. I tightened the bolt until my knuckles turned white. "Getting there," I said. He nodded. He took a sip of his drink and looked at the sky. "Take your time." That is why I stayed. Because he didn't push. At night, I returned to garage. Not mine. Caleb's crew offered me full access while I figured things out. They called it garage therapy. It was simple. No pressure. No pity. Just tools, sweat, and the occasional story that made everyone laugh too hard. Tara showed up once during those days. She dropped off a box of parts for her car. She didn't mention the bonfire. She didn't ask for the gossip. She just gave me a quiet smile and a nod, like we were both carrying heavy things we didn't feel like unpacking yet. The silence felt comfortable. It was the kind of silence you share with people who understand the world is loud enough on its own. By the 6th day, my phone had stopped buzzing altogether. No texts, no missed calls, no guilt trips. It was as if Dana had finally understood that the leash had slipped, and I wasn't turning back to hand it to her. That night, I was alone in the shop. The others had gone home. I was wiping down a socket set under the flickering fluorescent light. The radio was playing something low and bluesy. I caught my reflection in the rear-view mirror of Caleb's Camaro. I looked tired. I had grease under my fingernails and dark circles under my eyes. But I didn't look broken. I didn't look angry. I looked free. Have you ever realized how little noise you actually need to feel whole? It isn't the music. It isn't the validation. It isn't the late-night apologies. It is the absence of tension. It is the kind of silence that doesn't demand a response. I used to be afraid of that silence. I used to chase words and signs and reassurances like I needed them to breathe. Now I let the quiet speak for me. And it told me one thing clearly. I was done going back to someone who only reached for me when she felt me slipping away. I was elbow deep in the Mustang's undercarriage, wrestling with a stubborn suspension strut, when I heard the garage door rumble open. It wasn't Caleb. Not this early. It wasn't any of the crew, either. They always texted first. The sound of the footsteps was too slow, too tentative. It sounded like someone who was unsure if they belonged there. I froze. I took a breath. I slid out from under the car on the creeper, a rag in my hand. And there she was, Dana. She had her hair down. She was wearing a hoodie zipped halfway up. No makeup. No act. Just her, standing on the grease-stained threshold of a world she had never cared to understand. She looked small against the backdrop of tool chests and hanging tires. She held something in her hand. A folded envelope, maybe? I never found out what it was. Because before I could speak, she did. I slept with someone. She blurted it out. One breath. No build-up. No explanation. Just that. The words hung there, caught between the smell of motor oil and stale concrete. They didn't echo. They just sat heavy in the air, sucking the oxygen out of the room. I dropped the wrench I was holding. It wasn't a dramatic drop. It wasn't thrown with fury. It just slipped from my fingers. Clang. It hit the concrete once, clattered, and then settled into silence. She waited. She was watching my face, her eyes wide and watery. She was waiting for the explosion. She was waiting for me to scream, to throw something, to fall to my knees and ask who or when or why. Because something in her eyes told me this wasn't just a confession. It was a test. She was looking for a reaction. Any reaction. Anger would mean I still cared. Heartbreak would mean she still had power. Begging would mean she still had leverage. She wanted to prove that she could still wreck me. But as I stood there, wiping the grease from my hand with the rag, I felt nothing. I didn't feel the floor drop out. I didn't feel the rage boil over. I just felt a strange, cold finality, like closing a book you never really liked reading anyway. I nodded once, just once. I turned back toward the car. Her voice cracked, desperate now. Did you hear me, Mark? I leaned against the fender of the Mustang. I looked at the suspension strut I had been working on. Yeah, I said. I heard you. She took a step forward, entering the light. It didn't mean anything, she rushed to say. I was lonely, and you were always gone, and I didn't know how to reach you. I thought. She trailed off. I looked at her then. I didn't look at her with hate. I looked at her with something much colder. Disinterest. It's fine, I said simply. She blinked, stunned. Fine. Yeah, I said. You don't owe me anything anymore, Dana. That landed harder than any scream would have. I saw the color drain from her face. Because in that moment, she realized it wasn't forgiveness she needed. It was proof she still mattered. And she didn't. Not like she used to. Not in the way she thought she could reclaim by breaking something we hadn't shared in months. She was chasing a consequence and finding none. She had fired her biggest cannon, and the cannonball had just rolled across the floor harmlessly. Tears welled in her eyes. Her lip trembled. Say something, Mark, she cried out. Yell at me. Do something. I tightened the oil cap on the valve cover. I didn't look up. What do you want me to say? I asked quietly. That you care, she whispered. I paused. I wiped a smudge of dirt from the fender. That's not my ride anymore, Dana. She stood there for a long time. The silence of the garage was deafening. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent light and her ragged breathing. And she knew. She finally knew. She turned slowly, almost stumbling. She walked out of the garage without another word. The heavy metal door groaned closed behind her, shutting out the night, shutting out the drama, shutting out the past. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, hands stained with grease, chest strangely still. I wasn't numb. I wasn't wrecked. I was just done. Can you imagine what it feels like when the storm finally stops, and you look around and realize it never washed you away? That day, I didn't fall apart. I fell forward, and I never looked back. The paperwork was cleaner than I expected. 2 signatures. A few stamps from a notary who looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. A sterile manila folder handed across a desk in a downtown office that smelled faintly of old carpet and printer ink. Just like that, 5 years of marriage folded into a legal envelope. I filed for divorce the morning after she confessed in the garage. I didn't wait. I didn't hesitate. I didn't spend days agonizing over whether we could fix it. When a glass shatters that completely, you don't try to glue it back together. You just sweep it up so you don't get cut anymore. There were no theatrics. There was no public announcement on Facebook. I didn't change my relationship status with a dramatic quote about betrayal. I just moved. Dana didn't contest it. I think, in the beginning, she didn't believe it was real. She probably thought my silence was still a tactic. She thought I was playing hard to get, that I was trying to punish her until she begged enough. She thought this was a negotiation. But you can't negotiate with someone who has already left the building. Then the calls started coming. Not from her. She had lost that privilege. They came from our mutual friends. The couples we used to have barbecues with. The people who knew us as Mark and Dana. Hey, Mark. They would say, their voices dripping with that specific kind of awkwardness people have when they don't know whose side to pick. Is everything okay? Dana says you've been distant. She says she's been trying to reach out. I didn't explain. I didn't air our dirty laundry. I didn't tell them about the clingy comment or the confession in the garage. I just told them, we're done. And gradually, the calls stopped. The invitation slowed down, then stopped entirely. Not for me, but for her. It is a strange thing about social circles. People notice when someone is vibrating with desperation. They notice when someone is trying too hard to prove they are happy. Dana hosted a birthday party 2 weeks later. I wasn't there, obviously, but I heard about it. Half the guests never showed up. Photos popped up on social media. Her smiling a little too wide, holding a drink, looking around a room that felt too empty. You could feel the loneliness radiating through the pixels. At work, she used to eat lunch with 3 women from the marketing department. I heard through the grapevine that she was sitting alone more often now. Still dressed sharp, still composed. But the table was empty, because people notice when your presence becomes noise instead of warmth. And eventually, people walk away from noise. Meanwhile, my life didn't explode. I think that is what we fear most about divorce, isn't it? We think our lives will detonate. We think we will be left standing in a crater. But my life just cleared. It was like fog pulling back from a coastline that had always been there, just hidden. I filled the silence with motion. I spent hours at the garage. I took road trips with Caleb and the crew, driving nowhere in particular with the windows down and music bleeding into the stars. I started reading again. Real books, not articles on my phone, but paperbacks with dog-eared pages and bent spines. I sat in coffee shops, reading for hours, not as an escape, but just because I could. I was living, just living. The house sold quietly. I let her keep most of the furniture. I didn't want it. I didn't want the couch where she slept that first night. I didn't want the dining table where we ate that cold steak. Too many ghosts. They weren't the kind of ghosts that rattled chains. They were memories that took up air I needed for myself. People think closure is a confrontation. We watch movies where the hero screams at the villain in the rain or slams a door so hard the plaster cracks. We think closure is a final word. But sometimes closure is just paperwork. Sometimes it is a quiet drive to a new apartment. Sometimes it is cooking a meal for one, simple pasta maybe, and eating it without flinching at the sound of a key in the door. It is the knowledge that you are not mourning love anymore. You are walking away from neglect. Can you understand that? Can you understand that freedom doesn't always feel like a parade? Sometimes it feels like nothing. It feels like peace. It feels like taking a breath and realizing your chest doesn't hurt anymore. Dana reached out one last time during the process. It was a voicemail. I saw the notification pop up while I was at the grocery store buying coffee. I didn't listen to it right away. I finished my shopping. I drove home. I unpacked. Then, sitting on my new balcony, looking out at a view that didn't include a dying garden, I played it. There were no tears in her voice, just a long pause. I think I ruined something good, she said. That was it. I deleted it. I didn't delete it out of anger. I deleted it out of certainty. Because there's a point in your life when you have to stop being someone else's lesson and start being your own beginning. I wasn't her teacher anymore. I wasn't her safety net. I was just Mark. And for the first time in 5 years, being just Mark felt like enough. It had been about a month since the voicemail. I barely noticed the days stacking up, not because I was avoiding them, and not because I was hiding from them, but because I was finally living inside them. When you are unhappy, time drags. Every hour feels like a negotiation with your own patience. But when you are at peace, time just flows. It moves like a river, steady and unconcerned with whether you are watching it or not. Then came the drive-in. Caleb had mentioned it offhand earlier in the week. A local pop-up cinema was taking over the old fairgrounds for a Friday night flick. Cars parked under string lights, audio piped through old-school radio frequencies, the smell of popcorn drifting on the wind. It sounded perfect. It sounded like the kind of Americana I had missed while I was busy being miserable. "We're going," Caleb said. "Bring the Mustang. She deserves a night out." Tara was going too. She had been around more lately. We hadn't put a label on anything. We hadn't had a talk. There was no pressure, no assumptions, just shared silences and glances that didn't ask for explanations. We pulled into the lot just as the trailers began to play on the massive white screen. The sky was a deep bruised purple, fading into night. Tara was in the passenger seat. She had her feet up on the dash, something I would have scolded Dana for, worrying about scuff marks. But with Tara, I just smiled. She was sipping something sweet and carbonated from a paper cup, humming along to the pre-show music. And for once, I wasn't thinking about the past. I wasn't checking my phone. I was just there. Until I saw her. It was a coincidence, I suppose. It is a small town, after all. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe she knew I frequented the car meets, and this was adjacent to that world. She was a few rows back, parked alone in a silver sedan I didn't recognize. A rental, maybe. Her window was rolled halfway down. She spotted me instantly. I felt it, that sharp recognition, like a pinprick to the chest. It wasn't love. It wasn't hate. It was just the body remembering a reflex it used to have. She stepped out of the car. She walked toward us slowly, navigating between the parked vehicles. She moved like someone moving through water, fighting a current, unsure if the destination was worth the effort. I stayed seated. Tara noticed her approaching. She stopped humming. She glanced at me, then at Dana. She didn't move to get out. She didn't say a word. She just watched quietly, her hands folded over her knee, giving me the space to handle it. Dana stopped a few feet from my window. The light from the movie screen flickered across her face. She looked different. Not worse, necessarily. Just faded, like a photograph that has been left in the sun too long. "Hi," she said. Her voice was low, barely audible over the sound of the movie trailer blaring from my speakers. I reached over and turned the volume knob down. "Evening," I said. I didn't unlock the door. Her eyes scanned the interior of the car. They landed on Tara, then flicked back to me. There was a flinch, a tiny recoil, but she swallowed it down. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said. "It's a public lot," I replied. She tried to smile, but it wilted before it could fully form. She looked cold. She crossed her arms over her chest, rubbing her elbows. "I thought—" She started, then stopped. She took a breath. I thought maybe we could talk. Just for a minute. I looked at her. I remembered the woman who used to send me 10 texts an hour. I remembered the woman who told me not to be clingy. I remembered the woman who stood in the garage and tried to break my heart just to see if it still worked. And I realized I had nothing left to say to her. We had said everything in the silence of the last 3 months. I looked at Tara, who offered me a small, reassuring nod. Then I looked back at Dana. I reached for the window crank. "I don't think so, Dana," I said gently. "Mark, please." She stepped closer. "I just want to explain." I shook my head. "There is nothing to explain. You are free. I am free. Let's keep it that way." I rolled the window up. I didn't slam it. I didn't rush it. I just turned the handle, watching the glass rise between us. It was a physical barrier, yes, but it was also a symbolic one. Through the glass, I said the last words I would ever say to her. "Enjoy the show." I turned the volume back up. Her face crumpled in that split second. It wasn't devastation. It was realization. It was the kind of realization that doesn't come with thunder and lightning. It comes with a quiet, immovable wall. She stood there for another moment, staring at a man she used to know. Then she turned. She walked back to her car, her shadow stretching long and thin against the gravel. Tara didn't say anything immediately. She didn't need to. She just reached over and placed her hand on my shoulder. A squeeze. A connection. We watched the rest of the movie with a tub of popcorn between us and the headlights of 100 cars flickering on the blacktop like constellations. Somewhere in the second act, I glanced at the rear-view mirror. The silver sedan was gone. There was just a car-shaped vacancy where she had once stood. And in that reflection, I didn't see loss. I saw a man who had finally stopped chasing closure. I saw a man who understood that peace isn't what you find after the fire burns out. It is what you build when the ashes settle, and you choose not to rebuild the same house on the same foundation. Because healing isn't a comeback. It isn't about returning to who you were before the hurt. You can't fit into those old clothes anymore. Healing is a decision. It is a decision to leave the ruins behind and walk toward whatever is next, even if you don't know where the road leads. I looked at Tara, laughing at something on the screen. I looked at the dashboard of the Mustang I had built with my own hands. I looked at the night sky. I realized I didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow. I didn't know where this thing with Tara was going. I didn't know if the car would start in the morning. And for the first time in a long, long time, I like not knowing, because not knowing means anything is possible. Thank you for following this journey to the end. If this story hit you somewhere real, if it touched a nerve or memory you've been carrying around, I would love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Share your story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, silence can be strength. And walking away, sometimes that is the bravest direction you can take. Take care of yourselves.